Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sid, and in today's video I am going to be talking about manatees, specifically the ones that live in Florida in the United States. This is a video I never expected to make because what could I be possibly talking about to do with manatees? But after some digging I found that some people are at war with them. And what sent me down this rabbit hole was looking into the time a manatee was found with the word Trump scraped into the back of it, which is short for Donald Trump, who is the current president of the United States. And to most people it would make no sense to do something like that, but after looking into this manatee situation, it is not surprising. Because manatees are a protected species, to a select group of people, they represent restriction, a lack of freedom, and just a general nuisance. So I have been very shocked to find the lengths that some people will go to try and get those protections removed. So before people started to invasively mess with manatees, they already had a bunch of other struggles in their everyday life. They get struck by boats, the waters they live in are being polluted, and their main food sources are diminishing. They mainly eat a variety of seagrasses found in freshwater and saltwater environments. An adult manatee needs to eat 100 pounds of seagrass a day to survive. But algae has been overtaking the waters where the manatees live and the seagrass grows, completely destroying it and the water quality. The seagrass situation has been on a downward trajectory for quite some time. Without a stable food source for the manatees, they have been starving and dying off in record numbers.
The conservation groups say we're used to seeing manatees die from things like boat strikes or cold weather, but they say this is the first time we're seeing a large number of manatees show up to a place where they're expecting a full buffet of seagrass, but then not finding enough or any. And as a result, hundreds of them are dying.
But fortunately, there has been a non-profit called Save Crystal River helping to restore the seagrass. Save Crystal River works to restore and protect the waterways in the Crystal River region of Florida. The group is comprised of friends, family members, and prominent members in their community. They have received millions of dollars of funding from the government to remove algae and plant a type of seagrass called eelgrass. With that money, they hired a company called Sea and Shoreline, where they vacuum all of the muck from the bottom of the waterways and dispose of it. In order to get their initial funding, they went to all of the schools in the area and got the kids to write letters to legislators for why they wanted Crystal River to be cleaned up. And on those letters, a lot of kids drew pictures of manatees. And on the boxes that the letters were carried in, there were also many drawings of manatees. You can also make a donation on their website to feed a manatee, where they will then plant some seagrass, which will then ultimately become food for manatees. And various short-form documentaries have been made on what's happening with the manatees, and Save Crystal River is always framed as the group of people spearheading the Save the Manatees charge. But manatees are far from Save Crystal River's main focus. Their primary purpose is to make Crystal River crystal clear again.
And they are all working toward a very specific goal.
Our goal is to have the river restored to its original beauty
By July 2nd
of 2023.
The algae was killing off the seagrass and making the once clear water murky and undesirable for recreation. But if they were able to bring back the seagrass, it would help stabilize the sediment and make it harder for algae to appear, which would make the water clearer and desirable for recreation. As of today, there are over 8,000 manatees in Florida, but they wanted the waters to be as clear as they were in the 60s, when there were only around 600 manatees.
What we want to see is that it's brought back to its pristine condition like it was in the 60s, where the water was so clear that you could look off anybody's dock and you'd see fish and crabs and grasses, and it would be just absolutely beautiful.
So in a massive plot twist, Save Crystal River was no longer taking aim at just algae. they were taking aim at the manatees. Despite using them for donations and them basically being the face of their campaign, they were getting in the way of making Crystal River crystal clear again. So what started off as a pretty wholesome project amongst friends took a pretty dark turn. For a while there has been a dislike for the manatees from members of the public. Because manatees are a protected species, the entire Crystal River has been designated as a manatee refuge. So that means there's speed restrictions on power boats, and during the winter months, areas are set aside especially for manatees where boats are totally prohibited, and some people do not like that.
I had someone once come up to me and say, you know, I wasn't here for dinosaurs. Why do my kids have to see manatees? You have lobbying industry that one extreme say, I want to go fast in my boat. I have that right. You shouldn't be imposing any restrictions on me.
There are groups out there that have complained for some time about the number of manatee zones and the length of those zones.
One person who definitely isn't a fan of the manatees is the Vice President of Save Crystal River, Steve Lamb. In relation to the restrictions around the manatees, he told NPR, "For 30 years, I've watched them take one bite at a time out of our community, whether that's rules, regulations, whatever it is. We've decided enough is enough." So Save Crystal River attended a Marine Mammal Commission meeting in 2015, and Steve spoke about the supposed impacts that the manatees are having on their project.
Many of our members are third to fifth generation Floridians and are the most affected culturally, financially, and in quality of life experiences by the policies set forth by this Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the Florida Wildlife Commission. We have been asked what we like and dislike about manatees in our community. Manatees have given our entire community a greater love and respect for our ecosystem. However, there are a number of challenges involved living with manatees, because man is as much a part of nature as the rest of the creatures.
During the process of trying to get funding for their restoration project, they said that tourism would benefit from clearer water.
Nature-based tourism is a vital piece of our economy, but one encounter with this dreaded algae is enough to turn them and their acquaintances away for good. Lost revenues are terrible for any city, county, or state.
According to Steve, the vice president of this group, there is too much tourism going on. Manatee tourism does have an impact on manatees and the seagrass they need to eat, but that is not Steve's problem. His main concern seems to be that it interferes with locals who want to use the water and the residents who live by the water.
We have major issues with the excessive number of SUP permits. 44 of them have been issued, that have been issued by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, allowing up to 6 boats per permit and boats carrying up to 40 passengers each to view manatees. The excessive number of permits has created too much pressure, crowded primarily into the residential canals and springs surrounded by Kings Bay. Not to mention the impact it has on local residents living along these waterways.
But after talking about that, he brings it back to Save Crystal River's problem with the manatees. They're eating the grass they're trying to plant.
Studies show that Kings Bay is an imperiled ecosystem with very little native vegetation. As we work to restore our bay and replant native grasses, we are concerned that the manatees will eat the grasses before they develop a sufficient root system to enable their survival. Due to the restrictions imposed by the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, we will be prevented from cordoning off newly planted grass beds that could seed our river and aid in the restoration process. In any ecosystem, there needs to be a balance of the resources needed to support all plants and animals. Unfortunately, the sheer number of manatees in Kings Bay can restrict this balance. Once they arrive in the Gulf waters, manatees are reported to eat seagrass down to the bare sand. We have significant concerns for the effect the continued increase in the manatee population will have in our coastal seagrass beds. Excessive grazing of these beds could have a domino effect on other species competing for limited food, shelter, as the manatee population continues to grow in this region.
Sea and Shoreline, the company Save Crystal River hired to help clean the waters and plant the seagrass, came up with a temporary solution to this problem.
That plant has to grow and prosper and not become a meal for our manatee friends.
Well, maintenance. These cages that Sea and Shoreline have developed, there's a good picture of it, that fit firmly into the ground with what I'll describe as some sandbags around it to hold it. Keeps the potential herbivores?
Herbivores, yes.
I learned that name. The herbivores, which includes manatees and several other species, from eating the plants before they get well rooted.
And because of their endangered status, there were restrictions around the times of year they could plant the grass.
And we are going to buckle down and focus and get as much work done as possible. We've got a hard stop date as November 15th as manatee season comes in. There's no in-water work during manatee season.
So Save Crystal River wanted the manatees removed from the endangered species list and have their protections stripped from them so they could plant their grass in peace. But going to these meetings and pitching for why manatees suck wasn't working for them as quickly as they would have liked. So they enlisted the help of the Pacific Legal Foundation. The Pacific Legal Foundation are a California-based non-profit legal organization who specialize in taking the protections of animals away from them. They like to try and roll back, weaken, block, or change state and federal wildlife protections. They have done this to many animals like the California gnatcatcher, golden parakeet, the Preble's meadow jumping mouse, the black-capped vireo, the lesser long-nosed bat, the wood-stork, the wolverine, and they've even attempted to have the polar bear removed from the endangered species list.
This listing opens the door for regulators and environmental extremists to target all sorts of productive activities and to regulate or sue energy producers, food producers, builders, and other industries, and activities that produce greenhouse gases. In other words, the listing is simply a backdoor way for environmental extremists and government regulators to regulate or halt more and more activities they disfavor under the guise of saving the polar bear.
Fortunately, they lost that battle. They go after these animals on behalf of agriculture industry clients, the Farm Bureau Federation, and ranchers associations. Every year they receive tens of millions of dollars in donations from a range of donors. And according to Exxon Secrets, which is an exposed website by Greenpeace, the Pacific Legal Foundation has received $175,000 from ExxonMobil since 1998. For years they would receive tens of thousands of dollars from them. If you don't know what that company is, they are an oil and gas company who contribute significantly to pollution. So the Pacific Legal Foundation fights to take the rights of animals away so that their donors can benefit off of the lack of restrictions and wreak havoc on the environment. So Save Crystal River knew that this kind of legal team was exactly what they needed to solve their problem. The Pacific Legal Foundation's first course of action on behalf of Save Crystal River was in July 2015. They sent a warning to the US Fish and Wildlife Service that if they did not address their request to downlist the manatee from endangered to threatened, then they would sue. The FWS had 60 days to address this request, but they didn't address it at all, so the Pacific Legal Foundation had to sue to force them to do something. And then because their hand was forced, the FWS announced that they would be looking into removing the manatee from the endangered species list. They had 12 months to decide what to do.
Today, we are announcing a proposal to reclassify the manatee from an endangered status to a threatened status.
And of course, there was a bunch of backlash to that for various reasons.
They need protection ongoing because manatee are extremely vulnerable in terms of what can kill them off.
Delisting them would, for one, make those sanctuaries possible areas to be developed, and that would take away more habitat for them and potentially cause a lot of problems for the animals that are recovering.
We've lost over 47,000 acres of the seagrass that manatees rely on over the last couple of years. We still have so many other habitat and climate related issues that may negatively affect manatee in the future that I just don't know that they're really ready to be reduced from endangered to threatened.
Some of the practical outcomes are that with a threatened species, you often have less staffing and funding being put into helping to implement the recovery actions that are necessary.
After all of that, the FWS was still deliberating on what to do. They were still investigating and gathering information. One piece of information was a manatee count that they did in January 2017, where they counted 6,620 manatees, which was the highest number of manatees since the survey started in 1991. The same month, Pacific Legal Foundation and Save Crystal River were growing impatient. They sent another 60-day warning, letting them know that they would sue if they didn't hurry up and come to a decision. Then a few months later, in April 2017, it was announced that the West Indian manatee would be downgraded from endangered to threatened. The Pacific Legal Foundation posted their victory all over their website and of course mentioned multiple times they were doing it on behalf of Save Crystal River. But it is not mentioned anywhere on Save Crystal River's own website, when getting an animal removed off of the endangered species list is a pretty big accomplishment, even though it's pretty bad. But they may not be so quick to boast about their accomplishment because of what happened next. 4 years later, the manatees began to die off in record numbers. In 2021, manatees were dying of starvation more than ever before.
She looks skinny, you can see her ribs.
Cell phone video after cell phone video show starving manatees breaching the shore and feeding desperately on any plant life they can find on the Treasure Coast.
When a manatee starves to death, it's an extremely painful process, and basically their insides melt and turn to liquid.
This prompted the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to declare an unusual mortality event in March 2021. Around 1,100 animals died, which is nearly double the 5-year average.
And because of all of the deaths, animal advocates, manatee experts, and conservationists believed it was a mistake to downgrade the manatee.
You get really mad because we warned over and over these problems. We could get to a situation we may never recover from it.
This was kind of known about for a long time, that there were some problems and issues in the Indian River Lagoon with lack of seagrasses, and we just reached a tipping point. I feel like the downlisting may have been premature, definitely.
The late manatee expert John Reynolds said that the data they used to declassify the manatee was out of date.
In reaching the decision it did, the federal government used out-of-date data. And so one thing that we need to be vigilant, because I'm not sure that the assumptions that the government made are in fact going to turn out to be right.
In order for the government to come to their decision to downgrade the manatee, they entered a whole bunch of assumptions into a model to see how things would be like for the manatees in 100 years. They entered a total of 7 assumptions into this model, which were things like boat-related manatee deaths and the frequency in which cold years occurred, and this model concluded that manatees would be fine for the next 100 years. But in 2021, that was seemingly not the case. Things got so bad that officials began to feed the manatees. Oftentimes, the feeding of wild animals is completely admonished by the authorities because you don't want to get wild animals used to seeking out food from humans and getting injured in the process of doing that, among other problems. And honestly, I have the belief that if we cause an issue for an animal, we should help them out of it. But with the manatees, at first glance, it wasn't as if humans caused the series of events that caused them to starve. Algae was kind of just viewed as something that flares up and destroys everything, and that's just nature. A previous time when the algae flared up and killed high numbers of manatees was in 2013, and that was taken into consideration with the model used to declassify the manatee. But the way it was considered was that the 2013 die-off due to algae in the same area was a short-lived event that would not persist as a chronic source of mortality. So the 2013 algae issue was viewed as a random happening that they didn't expect would happen again in the future. But as it turns out, it was not just a random happening. It was discovered that humans were responsible for triggering the algae outbreak in 2013 and in 2021, which was responsible for killing thousands of manatees. So officials feeding these wild manatees was totally valid because humans did cause them to starve to begin with. The real problem behind everything was the pollution in the waterways. People's septic tanks have been leaking into the water and causing the algae to flare up, subsequently killing the seagrass.
If you've lived in Florida for any amount of time, you're used to those wake zones and speed limits to protect the manatees from boats and propeller strikes, right? But the new problem, the new killer, the biggest issue is the pollution in our water.
The starvation was somewhat inevitable as humans didn't take, notice of the nutrient pollution that we've been dumping into our estuaries.
We have leaking septic tanks, we have sewer systems that are not functioning properly. So all of these kinds of nutrients getting into the waterways can then fuel these harmful algae blooms.
All these homes along the lagoon that are on septic tanks are slowly leaking literally tons of nitrogen and phosphorus into the system.
Over 2,000 deaths since 2020, which is a huge increase and extremely concerning and mostly tied to unchecked pollution and water quality.
And it's all sort of ironic for Steve Lamb because he tried to make it seem as though the manatee's excrement was the problem, when in reality it was people like him who were the problem.
We are also concerned about the possible nutrient overload from manatee excrement deposited into Kings Bay on a daily basis. No sufficient scientific study has been conducted to answer this question conclusively. It is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. What are the possible effects of such large quantities of animal feces and associated gut bacteria from a still growing population being directly deposited into the waters they share with humans? Now that the manatee herd has exceeded 700 animals, primarily congregating in 4 major spring regions of the entire bay, this issue should be studied under current conditions. Specifically, we would like to know if there have been any studies conducted to examine the impact of this large volume of manatee excrement and bacteria into a water body for potential impact on humans, water quality, and/or soil chemistry.
After it was discovered what was really causing all of these issues for the manatees, there was a push to have them return to the endangered species list, because part of the assumptions used to delist them were inaccurate, and people and their septic tanks weren't going to go anywhere for a very long time and would continue to pose issues for manatees. But fortunately, even though manatees were no longer on the endangered list and just classified as threatened, they were actually still protected by the Endangered Species Act. So an animal advocacy group, United Bear Warriors, sued the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, aka the FDEP, for violating the Endangered Species Act.
Many are dying from starvation because their food source is shrinking, and that problem is at the core of a new lawsuit from Bear Warriors United. The Florida nonprofit is suing the State Department of Environmental Protection secretary. The lawsuit alleges the state's regulations for water and sewer discharge are killing off seagrass in the Indian River Lagoon, and it says that's causing the record number of manatee deaths.
The FDEP attempted to get that lawsuit thrown out. They believed Bear Warriors United didn't have legal standing to pursue the case, but fortunately the judge believed they did, and allowed them to proceed with the lawsuit. In court, the FDEP tried to make it seem as though the lawsuit was totally redundant. The FWS publicly and conveniently announced that the mass die-off of manatees had administratively ended on March 14th, 2025, and FDEP reiterated those sentiments in court. But despite them considering the die-off over, it was far from over. The water pollution issue from septic tanks had been an issue for a long time. The tanks had been causing so many issues that in 2010, a law was passed that required septic tank owners to get an inspection every 5 years to make sure they weren't polluting the state's waterways. But septic tank owners weren't happy with that, and 2 years later, legislators cancelled the inspections. But it was still an issue, and in 2021, Governor Ron DeSantis said Florida would commit over $50 million to the algae problem and remove 3,000 septic tanks. So clearly they knew there was an issue there. In court, a testimony was given from environmental scientist Peter Barral. In 2018, he published a scientific paper on the harmful role of sewage pollution in the waters and the impact it has on seagrass and manatees. So in court, he talked about all of that. On top of that, 2024 was a record-breaking year for baby manatee deaths, likely due to chronic malnutrition among mothers who survived earlier starvation events. Things were pretty grim for the manatees, and it wasn't going to stop. So because of that, they won the lawsuit. In April of this year, 2025, the judge ruled that the state had violated the Endangered Species Act by allowing too much pollutants to flow into the waters.
Earlier this month, a federal judge ruled in favor of Bear Warriors United and against the state, finding Florida's Department of Environmental Protection was, quote, in violation of the Endangered Species Act.
There was lax leadership from the state of Florida over decades that allowed this problem to get worse and worse.
The judge in the case ruled that there is a definitive causal link between Florida's Department of Environmental Protection wastewater regulations and the ongoing risk to manatees.
The ruling banned new septic tank construction and required FDEP to create a program for assessing, feeding, and monitoring manatees and their habitat. And once again, the FDEP filed to stop it from happening. They claimed that it would interfere with residential development and burden property owners, but the court refused to let it be halted. As of right now, the new protections are coming into play on July 17th, so not long after I upload this video. So hopefully no more spanners get thrown into the works. United Bear Warriors weren't the only ones to sue over this issue. Another lawsuit began over the manatees' protected areas known as critical habitat. Critical habitat is basically protected habitat that is essential for the conservation of endangered or threatened species. In 1976, the FWS designated almost 1 million acres of critical habitat to the manatees. Then with new manatee studies and scientific information coming in, they changed the definition of what should be included in manatee critical habitat. But even though they had a new definition around what was suitable for a manatee, they didn't change any areas of the manatee's critical habitat to ensure that it met the new updated meaning. So manatees had protected areas, but they didn't even know if they were suitable for them or not. Over 3 decades went by, and in 2008, the Save the Manatees Club, Defenders of Wildlife, and the Center for Biological Diversity petitioned the FWS to revise the critical habitat for the Florida manatee. At that time, it was determined that a revision of the manatee's critical habitat was warranted, but they had insufficient funding to do anything about it. As the years went by, manatees continued to die in record numbers, but they still weren't able to revisit the critical habitat issue. Things kept getting in the way, like the Save the Crystal River group fighting to get the manatee delisted. It wasn't until 2022 that the same group of people who called the critical habitat into question in 2008 filed a complaint against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The complaint was for unlawfully withholding and/or unreasonably delaying the revision of the critical habitat. From that, they came to a legal agreement that the FWS would remove almost 260,000 acres from the current near million acres of critical habitat that hadn't been suitable, and then further expand the critical habitat to a total of 1.9 million acres. So they were going to remove protection from areas that weren't even good for manatees to begin with, and then further protect 1 million more acres of area. So that is great news. And a study has been done that species with protected critical habitat are twice as likely to move toward recovery than species without it. So that was a step in the right direction. Also, on top of that, the same group of people, as well as the Animal Law and Policy Program, Miami Waterkeeper, and Frank S. Gonzalez Garcia attempted to get the manatees reinstated as endangered. They petitioned the FWS, but unfortunately they weren't as successful.
The Wildlife Service declined to consider changing the manatee status until it has a new model to work with, one that includes statistics from the unusual mortality event.
But this is an event that's been going on for years. It had already been going on for a year when we submitted our petition.
In short, says Whitlock, another review will take time the manatee simply does not have.
This is a species that is beloved and that needs help.
And that is unfortunate because apparently all of these issues are going to take a decade or more to fix.
The judge found it will take at least a decade for this part of the lagoon to start seeing recovery.
The state of Florida has admitted that it will be 12 to 15 years before seagrasses start to recover.
It was 10 years ago that Save Crystal River was blaming all of these problems on the manatee. So had they actually acknowledged the real issue instead of wasting time delisting the manatee, then the manatees may have already been on the road to recovery. Despite Save Crystal River having it out for the manatees, their project proved to be pretty successful and pretty valuable to manatees and other animals. Crabs and fish had also been dying because of the algae, and death rates for dolphins due to malnutrition had also spiked. Since there was less seagrass, there was also less fish around, but Save Crystal River has actually done a pretty good job at returning the water to its crystal clear state. It has been chosen as an area to release rehabilitated manatees, whether they like it or not.
When the manatees from Zoo Tampa are ready to return to the wild, a destination of choice is the restored Crystal River ecosystem.
Crystal River in particular has changed and is such a bountiful environment for them that we're releasing those animals to that space.
It would have been great if they helped to undo the damage they did instead of leaving it up to animal advocacy groups, but at least they unwittingly created a manatee haven. But anyways, that is pretty much everything for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and let's take a moment of silence for all of the manatees. And I will see you in my next video.